Welcome to Module 9 of the Foundation Certificate in Trauma-Informed and Adoption-Competent Practice with Children and Families, an online certificate offered by the University of Vermont's Child Welfare Training Partnership. Welcome to this module, Culturally Responsive Practices, which was developed by Maria Mercedes Avila, PhD, in collaboration with the University of Vermont Department of Social Work. After this module, you'll be able to demonstrate increased self-awareness of racial, ethnic, and class biases, define cultural and linguistic competency, and indicate familiarity with the stages or continuum of cultural competency, describe the implications of demographic trends for health, social, and educational disparities, identify links between racial and health inequities and health disparities, and incorporate cultural and linguistic competence and national CLAS standards into your practice and service providing. We would like to start with an activity to challenge your thinking. Please draw 9 dots on a piece of paper in the formation you see on slide 4. Your instructions are to connect all the dots with 4 straight lines, and only 4. Do not lift your pencil off the paper or retrace any line. Lines may cross if necessary. Did you find a solution? Why do you think that most of us did not think of going outside the boundaries to solve the problem? To solve the problem, we had to get outside of our usual way of thinking, outside of the box we put ourselves in. We had to literally draw outside the lines. This is what is required of us when we interact with people who are different from us. We have to look at other ways of thinking about thinking. Drawing outside the lines is very difficult because we are so used to our own way of thinking and our own point of view that it is hard to see other points of view. To successfully interact with people from different backgrounds and different cultures, we must learn to look at the world from many points of view. One of the most current data we have on demographic changes in the United States comes from the State of America's Children 2014 report. In this report, we have demographic changes as well as current data on disparities in our society. Data from this report underscore the importance of focusing on cultural competence in 2016. By 2050, the U.S. is going to become a minority-majority country. The group leading these statistics is Hispanic Latino, and many of these families are monolingual or Spanish-speaking only. Therefore, it is essential that we train bilingual, bicultural providers that can serve these groups. We also see that poverty is a problem for many children of color in the United States. 33% of kids of color were poor in 2014. The consequences of early exposure to poverty can result in long-lasting problems for children like lower educational attainment, difficulty obtaining and retaining a job, etc. Research shows that early exposure to poverty and worrying about whether there will be food at the table can affect the development of a child's brain. Poverty is also related to a lack of access to health care and poor health outcomes. Lack of preventative care can affect a child's readiness to learn and consequently to succeed personally and educationally in our society. Cultural and linguistic competence, or CLC, can be defined as the ability to provide culturally responsive, including patient and family-centered care, to any child or family regardless of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, socioeconomic status, religious, or spiritual beliefs. Some people believe we don't have to focus or address CLC because Vermont is the second whitest state in the country, following Maine. But, regardless of whether we live in the least or most diverse state in the U.S., we must all understand CLC and become culturally responsive because we live in a multicultural country and world. We also must keep in mind that diversity is not limited to race and ethnicity, and that our clients may be diverse in terms of socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, etc. Other people believe that they are culturally competent because they have attended trainings or read books. However, you may find as you learn about CLC that you do not know as much as you thought you knew. Cultural and linguistic competence is an ongoing process that never ends. It is not finite, and consequently, we never actually achieve CLC. Some of the main reasons and rationale for cultural and linguistic competence in 2016 include responding to demographic changes in the U.S. as described in Slide 6, eliminating long-standing disparities in the health, educational, or social status of diverse communities, improve accessibility of services for all communities served. When we become more culturally responsive, we become better providers and human beings, so this work benefits all of us. Culturally and linguistic competence also helps us to comply with federal mandates. Many social service programs receive funding from Titles 1, 6, and 9. Among others, Title I is the federal program that provides funding to local school districts to improve the academic achievement of disadvantaged students. It is part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, first passed in 1965. Title VI was enacted as part of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. Title IX is a comprehensive federal law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any federally funded education program or activity. Again, here we describe the nature of Continuum of CLC. There is an animation in the slide, an arrow that moves up and down. This is to demonstrate that there are situations in which we might be culturally competent and situations in which we might be culturally incompetent. It is important to point out that we have all done these, and the fact that we move up and down the continuum depending on situations speaks to the ongoing developmental learning process that CLC entails. The cultural competence continuum spans from cultural destructiveness on one end to cultural proficiency on the other end. Examples of cultural destructiveness include Native American genocide, the eugenics movement, Jim Crow laws, and slavery. Cultural incapacity includes ethnocentric practices or beliefs. Cultural blindness is when we treat everyone the same. This is not an effective approach because we are all different and we all have different needs. Having a blind approach means that we will not be able to effectively serve all communities, as this requires us to see differences, celebrate them, and learn from them. It is valuable to think of cultural competence as a journey and not a destination. One of the essential components of cultural and linguistic competency is awareness of our own assumptions, values, and biases, which we all have. It is impossible to live in this society and not have biases or prejudices when we are bombarded by these on a regular basis. CLC also entails a responsibility to learn about the diverse communities we serve and to inquire about what is best for them and their beliefs. Although we cannot be expected to be experts on every group, at a minimum, we must know about the groups we serve on a regular basis. Another tenet of CLC is patient and family-centered care and understanding that best practice is what is best for those we serve. The only way we are going to know what is best for our clients is by asking and inquiring and learning from them. Our clients are the experts of their lives, their children, and their families, and consequently need to be treated and respected as experts. Quiz Question 1, American Eugenics. For this question, it is important to know about American eugenics. Here is a short summary about the movement. American eugenics refers to compulsory sterilization laws adopted by over 30 states that led to more than 60,000 sterilizations of disabled individuals. Many of these individuals were sterilized because of a disability. They were mentally disabled or ill, or belonged to socially disadvantaged groups living on the margins of society. American eugenics laws and practices implemented in the first decades of the 20th century influenced the much larger National Socialist Compulsory Sterilization Program, which between 1934 and 1945 led to approximately 350,000 compulsory sterilizations and was a stepping stone to the Holocaust. Hitler studied eugenics and used this knowledge on concentration camps in Europe. In a recent article, the UK Guardian described this as Hitler's debt to America. Even after the details of the Nazi sterilization program, sterilizations in some American states did not stop. Some states continued to sterilize residents into the 1970s. Poor and socially ostracized families were targeted for investigation of the 3 Ds: delinquency, dependency, and mental defect. These families usually lived outside the accepted moral or social convention of middle-class America. Gallagher, page 37. The 3 Ds were used to target the poor, the disabled, French Canadians, and Native Americans. Women were targeted more than men. French Canadians and Abenakis were seen as a foe and threat to the early colonial settlers of Vermont. They represented an insidious and continuous invasion of Vermont and were therefore targeted. Gallagher, page 45. Studies done on degenerate families lines were often traced back to French Canadian or Native American ancestry and were used to target these groups. Gallagher, page 80 to 82. It is important to know about this history because our Abenaki groups do not trust the state or services offered through social and human service organizations. There is a history and valid reason for Native American groups to not trust these services, and we have a responsibility to know about these issues as well as the historical trauma many groups have suffered in the U.S. to date. Georgetown University's National Center for Cultural Competence, NCCC, is the leading organization on CLC in our country. NCCC describes 5 essential elements of CLC. These include valuing diversity as opposed to blind approaches, capacity for self-assessment, which means evaluating where we are on the cultural competence spectrum on both the personal and organizational levels to see the work that we need to do to work towards culturally responsive practices. Cross-cultural effectiveness, or being aware of our values and assumptions when interacting with diverse populations and being knowledgeable about the groups we interact with. Institutional cultural knowledge is the essential aspect of having leadership buy-in and having policies and procedures in place that embrace CLC in everything we do in our organizations, and adapting programs, assessments, and models to meet the specific needs of populations we serve. Quiz question 2, Equality versus Equity. An important aspect of CLC work is understanding the difference between equality and equity. Equality is legally driven, such as codes of ethics, procedures, and mandates. Equality would only work if we lived in a level playing field, which is not the case in our society, as many groups experience enormous disparities and inequities to this date. Equity has to do with fairness and giving people what they need to succeed and thrive in our society. This includes basic human rights like universal health care. Here is a visual representation of equality and equity. What differences do you see between the first image and the second image? We see in the first image that equality is giving everyone the same thing. It only works if everyone starts from the same place. Equity is about access to the same opportunities. We must first ensure equity before we can enjoy equality. Here we have 2 definitions of health disparities. We want to emphasize that these disparities are inherently unnecessary and avoidable and unfair and unjust. When we define an issue as unnecessary and avoidable, we are saying that these issues can be prevented. Disparities and inequities are not fixed conditions of society. We can make changes to reduce disparities, and must do so if we are to abide by the tenet of liberty and justice for all. Racial disparity is a serious problem in the child welfare system, where children and families may experience different treatment and varying access to services depending on their racial background. A related issue in child welfare is racial disproportionality, as children of color are overrepresented in the foster care system and tend to stay longer in foster care compared to their white counterparts. African American and American Indian Alaskan Native children have rates of placement in foster care that are 3 times as high as those of Caucasian children. African American children stayed in foster care for an average of 9 months longer than their white counterparts. We see growing rates of disproportionality among Latino children, who are now overrepresented in the child welfare system in 10 states. As the great majority of children and youth in the child welfare system have experienced significant trauma, it is important to consider how trauma and culture intersect. Social and cultural realities strongly influence children's risk for and experience of trauma. For example, non-white children are at increased risk for trauma exposure and subsequent development of PTSD. We also see high trauma rates among lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or questioning LGBTQ youth, both at home in the form of child abuse and in the community in the form of bullying and hate crimes. Immigrant and refugee families often experience trauma in their countries of origin and/or during the immigration process. These families often face additional traumas, including discrimination and deportation, and stressors, especially when they are undocumented. As children's, families, and communities' responses to trauma vary by group, it is essential to consider culture as we are working with families. Many children, especially children of color, who enter the child welfare system are from groups that experience discrimination, negative stereotyping, poverty, and high rates of exposure to community violence. Due to racial disparities described previously, families of color are often marginalized and lack access to resources and services. Families and communities may feel hopeless and powerless as a result. Research has shown that minority children often have more severe symptomology for longer periods of time than their majority group counterparts. We will further discuss disparities in mental health later in this module. There are many different manifestations of oppression. Ethnocentrism, or judging another culture solely by the values and standards of one's own culture, is a prime example. Ethnocentric individuals judge other groups relative to their own ethnic group or culture, especially with concern for language behaviors, customs, and religion. For example, we don't teach second languages in schools in Vermont until middle or high school, knowing that research shows that the younger the child is, the easier it is for him or her to learn second languages. Therefore, students are not likely to become bilingual or fluent. Ethnocentrism is the biggest obstacle to achieving culturally responsive practices. Oppressive behaviors lead to systems of oppression, or what we define as isms, such as racism, heterosexism, classism, ableism, ageism, etc. There are many implications of oppression for individuals and communities. Some of the clinical implications contribute to effects on communities. For example, if people suffer from depression, PTSD, racial trauma, and/or substance abuse, they have a higher chance of failing in school, being suspended, dropping out, being expelled, etc. This relates to limited educational mobility in the community, which contributes to limited economic mobility or poverty. Impaired access to resources directly results in social, educational, and/or health disparities. The information on this slide comes from the U.S. Surgeon General Report, Mental Health, Culture, Race, and Ethnicity, which documents the existence of striking disparities for minorities in mental health services and the underlying knowledge base due to being underrepresented in research. Racial and ethnic minorities have less access to mental health services than do whites. They are less likely to receive needed care. When they receive care, it is more likely to be poor in quality. Mental health disparities are significant for African American children who are 70% less likely to receive needed mental health services. African American youth also has lower rates of treatment for depression and lower referral rates to mental health care by the school system. If young people need professional assistance for depression and don't receive services or are not referred by the school systems for services, behaviors will get worse, chances of dropping out or failing in school increase, chances of being suspended or expelled also increase, and there is direct connection between school discipline practices and incarceration in the U.S., particularly for kids of color. Quiz question 3. There are 5 times as many white drug users as black in the U.S., yet black men are sent to state prison at a rate how many times greater than white men for the same drug-related offenses? The correct answer is B, 13. Racist practices have contributed to the mass incarceration of blacks and Latinos in the U.S. Michelle Alexander's book titled The New Jim Crow Laws, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness describes how there are more African Americans under correctional control today than there were slaves in 1850. The book also describes how racial profiling and other oppressive practices like the war on drugs and stop and frisk have increased the number of men in color in our correctional system. We see here that poverty rates for African American children are much higher than poverty rates for white children, and that 4 times as many Black children are living in extreme poverty. Why do you think that, even when African American youth graduate from high school, they have a greater chance of being unemployed and lower chance of going directly into college? Some reasons include Black students being exposed to lower academic curriculums, guidance counselors or teachers' biases towards kids of color, being tracked in school separate educational paths based on their academic performances as teens or younger. This includes youth with lower academic achievement being encouraged to pursue vocational training rather than college. This slide describes the controversial topic of school-to-prison pipeline and how school discipline is directly linked to incarceration of kids of color. The chart provides extensive information on statistics related to school-to-prison and foster care-to-prison practices. Blacks and Latinos represent 30% of the U.S. population, yet 61% of the incarcerated population. These are staggering statistics. On the bottom right, we see 2 graphs referring to the chances a Latino or Black boy has of being incarcerated in their lifetime, 1 in 3 for Black boys and 1 in 6 for Latino boys. Despite the fact that there is so much wealth in the United States, there is great income disparity, and many of our children are living in poverty. Spending the most in healthcare, as we do in the U.S., is not directly linked to good health outcomes. Quiz question 4. This question is about the CDC's and Healthy People's Social Determinants of Health, SDH. In the next slide, these social determinants are explained in depth. According to the CDC, lifestyle factors in and of themselves do not determine a person's overall health. In theory, genes, biology, and health behaviors together account for about 25% of population health. On the other hand, the social determinants of health, such as income, discrimination, access to quality health care, and safe and affordable housing, play a much larger role. The 5 main social determinants of health include economic stability, which includes poverty, employment, food security, and housing stability; education, such as high school graduation, enrollment in higher education, language and literacy, and early childhood education and development; social and community contexts, including social cohesion, civic participation, perceptions of discrimination and equity, incarceration, and institutionalization; health and healthcare, including access to healthcare, access to primary care, and health literacy; and neighborhood and built environment, such as access to healthy foods, quality of housing, crime and violence, and environmental conditions. This slide looks at a visual representation of the concept of culture. An iceberg is a good representation of culture because only 10% of an iceberg is visible and 90% is not. It is beneath the surface. When we see an iceberg, the portion which is visible above water is, in reality, only a small piece of a much larger whole. Similarly, people often think of culture as the numerous observable characteristics of a group that we can see with our eyes. The reality, however, is that these are merely an external manifestation of the deeper and broader components of culture, the complex ideas and deeply held preferences and priorities known as attitudes and values. For this activity, we will ask you to make 2 lists. First, list the aspects of culture that are observable. Keep in mind that observable aspects may or may not be noticeable or accurate. Some examples might include height and body language. Now we will ask you to list aspects of culture that are not observable. These are usually out of our own awareness. Some examples might include gender identity and values. How did your list compare? As you become more familiar with the cultures of those you serve, you will come to recognize and understand more of the elements that lie deep within that cultural group. The idea of culture as an iceberg reminds us that only a smaller portion of cultural aspects are more visible. The subsurface aspects will directly influence those on the tip of the iceberg. For example, religious beliefs influence holiday customs. When income, health insurance, and access to care are accounted for, disparities remain. In infant mortality, presence of chronic disease and insurance coverage, and life expectancy. This suggests that other factors are contributing to health disparities, including social and community context or social determinants of health, like discrimination, oppression, and incarceration practices. The essential elements of a person's life include both individual and collective history. Understanding the impact of collective history on individual behaviors helps us to see why, for example, some of the people with higher rates of substance use in our country are Native Americans. Yet many Americans are unaware of the Native American genocide, displacement, forced boarding school placement, and suffering these Native groups have been exposed to. The history of those traumas has been passed down through generations. Today, Native American youth have some of the highest suicide rates in the nation. The history of their suffering hasn't been effectively addressed, and trust has not been restored with Native groups. These are essential topics when working towards culturally responsive practices. As described earlier on in this module, we all carry biases and prejudices and are all capable of holding these beliefs. We have to be aware of our biases and identify them when they appear. We also must put them in check when we are working with those groups affected by our biases. Otherwise, we run the risk of exposing those we serve to a substandard level of care and services. Research from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services shows that despite medical advances, minorities still lag behind whites in many health indicators due to factors such as provider biases, poor provider-patient communication, and health literacy issues. This report link shows a direct link between provider bias and poor health outcomes, especially in communities of color. Quiz question 7. This question refers to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Minority Health, National Standards for Culturally and Linguistically Appropriate Services. These are 15 federal mandates organizations are required to follow if they received federal funding. These mandates are described in the following slide. Here is a list of the 15 CLAS standards. Principal Standard 1. Provide effective, equitable, understandable, and respectful quality of care and services that are responsive to diverse cultural health beliefs and practices, preferred languages, health literacy, and other communication needs. Governance, leadership, and workforce. 2. Advance and sustain organizational governance and leadership that promotes CLAS and health equity through policy, practices, and allocated resources. 3. Recruit, promote, and support a culturally and linguistically diverse governance, leadership, and workforce that are responsive to the population in the service area. 4. Educate and train governance, leadership, and workforce in culturally and linguistically appropriate policies and practices on an ongoing basis. Communication and language assistance. 5. Offer language assistance to individuals who have limited English proficiency and/or other communication needs at no cost to them to facilitate timely access to all healthcare and services. 6. Inform all individuals of the availability of language assistance services clearly and in their preferred language, verbally and in writing. 7. Ensure the competence of individuals providing language assistance, recognizing that the use of untrained individuals and/or minors as interpreters should be avoided. 8. Provide easy-to-understand print and multimedia materials and signage in the languages commonly used by the populations in the service area. Engagement, continuous improvement, and accountability. 9. Establish culturally and linguistically appropriate goals, policies, and management accountability, and infuse them throughout the organization's planning and operations. 10. Conduct ongoing assessments of the organization's CLAS-related activities and integrate CLAS-related measures into measurement and continuous quality improvement activities. 11. Collect and maintain accurate and reliable demographic data to monitor and evaluate the impact of CLAS on health equity and outcomes and to inform service delivery. 12. Conduct regular assessments of community health assets and needs and use the results to plan and implement services that respond to the cultural and linguistic diversity of populations in the service area. 13. Partner with the community to design, implement, and evaluate policies, practices, and services to ensure cultural and linguistic appropriateness. 14. Create conflict and grievance resolution processes that are culturally and linguistically appropriate to identify, prevent, and resolve conflicts or complaints. 15. Communicate the organization's progress in implementing and sustaining CLAS to all stakeholders, constituents, and the general public. This slide provides recommendations for addressing and eliminating health disparities. Integrative approaches include family and patient-centered practices and respecting the cultural beliefs and values of those we serve. We can also help to address the staggering disparities that currently exist in our society by having more services and more providers available in areas accessible to underserved groups. The demographic changes in our country are drastically changing what we look like as a society, and therefore we will need providers who mirror the cultural background of those we serve, including speaking the same language. There is a federal mandate to provide ongoing education and training on culturally responsive practices to providers, and to educate communities about their rights and services that are available to them. Here are some references and additional resources related to culturally responsive practices. Thank you for participating in this training.